It's like they're talking about they're born and raised in different dimensions or something. There is no translation. So you come out of the DMT thing understanding something which you can't say. And that's been the motivation of my whole public speaking life. The fact that I understand something that I can't say. Yeah, but I can almost say it. And some days closer than others. And so there's this constant reaching for the unspeakable. Wittgenstein talked about the unspeakable, which was, he said, everything which lay beyond what he called the present at hand. So we're embedded in this matrix of unspeakability, and then through language we send probes into it, forays toward meaning in the unspeakable, and then return with this sense of meaning. But meaning is very provisional. It is basically, as Whitehead brilliantly understood, a feeling. Meaning is a feeling. No matter how abstract the meaning may be, it ultimately is a feeling of recognition.
Terence, my brother studied with Maharishi for a couple of years in Switzerland, and he tells me that Sanskrit, as it was originally meant to be, has sound is sense component to it that is maybe analogous to that fundamental language that he talks about. I'm not saying that that's the fundamental language, but he's reported to me that if done right, and it was only done out loud back in the old days, that it was intended to mean what you heard was what it was, that the feeling was in the sound.
Yeah, well, I've spent a fair amount of time, not recently, but I remember it pretty well, studying Indian thought about sound. And it is a very profound and deeply worked out system, and it is definitely analogous to all of this. In the chakric system, which you're familiar with ad nauseum, I'm sure, but a part that is not normally stressed, but is very present in the original texts, is the idea that on the petals of these internal floral analogical structures are letters. And this is an extremely peculiar doctrine. Letters, which are sounds, seed mantras, and of course Vedic metaphysics is a whole theory of vibration. Much of Indian classical music, there are stories about musicians who could cause buildings to burst into flame by the power of their playing. I imagine that that's in some sense true. If you're interested in a fascinating study of all this that I've never heard anybody recommend in the New Age, it's apparently somehow out of their scope. It's a book by Arthur Avalon written in the 1920s called The Garland of Letters, and it's a discussion of the mantra shastra. Very, very interesting. And yes, the Vedic assumption is that Sanskrit is the primal revealed language, and that there are extremely special qualities associated with that language. This is interesting to talk about, or at least it's very interesting to me. As you probably know, Kabbalism, there's a whole schools of Hasidic mysticism where what it's about is the alphabet. And the Hebrew alphabet, for those people, is the primal Ursprach, and these are not simply letters, they are the letters. They are the letters that God intended to use to signify the presence of the G-D to man. Very interesting work on this by Stan Tenen, who's a fascinating figure, sort of like me in a way. I mean, I think half crackpot, half hopefully something else. But Stan has created a three-dimensional object, a sculpture, which, when illuminated with a bright source of light in a series of from a series of predictable points, casts shadows of all of the Hebrew letters. Do you understand what's happening here? It means that this object is a higher dimensional analog to the entire Hebrew alphabet, that you could think of the Hebrew alphabet as an object in hyperspace, slice it this way, aleph, this way, bet, this way, and so on. I told Ralph about this, Abraham, and he said, whoa, no problem. We could write a computer program that could take the letters of any language and backward engineer it upward to a higher dimension to get an object that would do that for Sanskrit, for English, for Arabic, whatever. And that seemed astonishing to me. And then he said, and you know what we could do once we had achieved that? We could take those probably five-dimensional objects, and we could do the calculation up to 8 or 9 or 10 dimensions, and we would eventually end up with an object that shed the letters of all alphabets into lower dimensions according to the angle of its regarding. Well, this kind of thing raises the hair on the back of my neck. We're actually getting somewhere, folks. And this sounds to me like God in some sense. I mean, I guess it's God to a printhead. It's God as the fountainhead of all alphabetical and glyphic signification of meaning as it pours through the universe. Very, very interesting concept. I ran across a passage recently that I was completely startled by. It's in Herman Melville's book Marty, which is his youthful travel journals around the South Seas before he got into the big guns. And but at one point in Marty, there's a discussion among some seamen on the deck of a ship about the future. And one of them is asking, what does it mean? What is the future? And this seaman looks up and he says, the future, 'tis all hieroglyphics. Very, very prescient comment. Because as we now know, we are code, we are DNA code. We're about to build a civilization made of code in VRML. And we are learning, languages like Perl and C++, and so in a sense, the future is all hieroglyphic. The world is all deception. It's some kind of a koan, or a problem, or a labyrinth, or a thing to be seen through. And if you don't figure it out, you would take it to be real. And then, it shunts you into the yawning grave. But if you can somehow realize that the purpose of your existence is to figure it out, and then figure it out, you will be, in some sense, liberated from it. There's a wonderful science fiction story that I remember from years and years ago. I can't remember the name of it, but it's by Robert Heinlein. And it's about a man who, he's some kind of commuter, some dullard. But as he leaves his house one morning on his way to his daily job, he looks down at the edge of his lawn, and a worm crawls out of the ground that has these golden pearlescent wings. And it flies off. And it's just this completely improbable thing, like a hallucination. And then later in the day, and he says to himself, it's an angel worm. It's an angel worm. And then later in the day, something else happens. I can't remember. And then later in the day, something else, equally improbable. And in the evening, he's sitting considering these three unlikely things, and he realizes that the E mat has slipped in the cosmic book, and that he was supposed to see an angleworm, but he saw an angel worm because the E had jumped position in the line of type that was describing what was going on. And then he begins to pay more and more attention, and he realizes then that he can find these typographical errors in reality. I only like the story for the idea that the world is made of elements that are completely hidden from us and don't betray themselves unless there's a glitch in the assembly languages, in the deeper levels of the system. And that's the raison d'etre for probing the edge, because those are like benchmark tests for the cybernetic system we're in. You know, you want to push it to the limit. Of course, the system can add 2 and 2, but, you know, can it carry out these complex factorial processes where if we're being shucked and jived, it might betray itself? So the technique then is to keep looking for just a chink in the door, just one way in. And psychedelics are it, as far as I can tell. And then, of course, some psychedelics more than others. But more and more I have this intuition that the world is like a literary construction of some sort. That this is much more like a novel than it is like the world of physics and entropy and equilibrium that we're cheerfully assured we should believe it is. Because what we feel in our own lives, I think, is the invisible hand of an author moving us to this affair, this decision to move, this career choice, this drug trip, so forth and so on. I mean, it is a very authored feeling to reality. And it hints that, as it says in Moby Dick, all visible things are but as pasteboard masks. If you would strike through the mask. And similarly obsessed and transcendental ravings. I just saw Moby Dick recently. I knew that Ray Bradbury had done the screenplay, and it's brilliant. But what I had forgotten was that John Huston was the director. God, it's amazing. I mean, it's nothing like the book, but for a flick, it's pretty good. Yeah.
Can you say a few words on what Watkins, what his objection or what his argument he responds to?
Yeah. There are really, in a sense, 2 Watkins objections. One is very specific and perhaps hard to understand in this context, but it's that as that structure that I showed you last night that had the well, maybe it's still here. Yeah. Well, let's not get too wild and woolly. This structure had to be valued, and the way I did it was I broke it down into its components and then assigned value to them. And we were looking at quantifying things like skew, degree of parallelism, distance between the 2 sides, overlap, congruency, things like that. So we quantified everything, and I started from the bottom, and I began valuing it. And out here I began getting a wave, which you could intuitively see was in fact a mathematical equivalency to this, and I proceeded, and it was all working. And then I got to position 32, and the entire thing fell to pieces. It didn't work anymore, and I was completely puzzled because I was very satisfied with the first 32 values, but after that I could see that it was garbage. And so then I noticed that this part of the wave is the same as this part of the wave, and this. So I instituted a new rule, or I added a rule to take care of this symmetry crossover, and I changed the signs of the quantification values as I crossed the midpoint here, and then it worked. And what Watkins objects to is this switch in sign as we crossed the midpoint. Now, Watkins is an algebraist, and my approach to this thing was largely geometric. I believe that I have answered this objection because, and how I do it, and you can see it at the website if this is your métier, I show that without the change of sign, these places where it is parallel and congruent and overlapping do not quantify to zero. And the total intuition of the thing from the get-go was these places where it all falls into congruency will quantify to zero. And they do quantify to zero if you make this switch here. So this is all graphically represented at the website, and I believe, although Watkins terrifies me, but I believe I've got him stymied on this, which it's a good thing because it's a hole in the heart. If he were right, it would be a hole in the heart. But he's not right. Now, the second half of the Watkins objection is slightly more difficult to deal with because but it's also slightly less powerful. And it is that he has written the equation that generates the data points that generate the fractal that we looked at last night. And the equation is a mess. It's just a huge, messy thing. And so he is saying it is too messy. This cannot possibly be the bedrock of nature. If this is the bedrock of nature, then Mother Nature is an hysterical, alcoholic, neurotic, living in the mission who wears fuzzy white bedroom slippers and stays indoors all day watching daytime TV. But I say that perhaps algebra is not, perhaps this looks messy algebraically, but there may be another way to do it that is very elegant, because the way I conceived it, it felt elegant at every point. It is elegant, but the equation is not elegant. And so, but let me say, elegance is a relative point, but still, among mathematicians, this is a very big deal. So we'll see. I'm not disturbed by all this. 25 years I promulgated the time wave, and nobody ever said anything other than that it was mighty peculiar, or they signed on completely. So finally, here comes somebody who says, well, no, my dear fellow, there appear to be some problems here. Well, I don't think any idea can conquer the intellectual universe without meeting its critics head on. So here is one, and thank God for it. This means that the idea is reaching a new level of maturity. And Watkins did not come to me as a critic. He came to me as we were going to do some work on the wave involving the search for high prime numbers. And then we went through the manual together, and he said, you know, your theory is becoming very well known, but your language is very imprecise from the point of view of a professional mathematician. So let's go through, and I, as a licensed practitioner of the art, will bring your language into congruence with the style of the field, and this will make you much more credible. But then as we started through it together, he began saying under his breath, "Oh dear, oh dear." And so now we'll see. But out of this came, for the first time, Watkins is the first person who ever wrote the equation that generates the data points. You see, all these other people, Peter Broadwell, Peter Meyer, Billy Smith, Leonard Byrne, all the people who worked on it in the original phase used the 384 data points that I presented them with, that was the boiled down of this quantification process. Once you have the 384 data points, the algorithm is robust. It's been gone over with a fine-tooth comb by the finest minds on the planet. It's okay. But those early stages on the way to the 384 data points, only my hatchet marks show through the woods. And God knows, if you know me, you know I could easily fuck up. So it's very important for people to go over it. And if any of you are mathematicians or simply motivated toward this, why, check it out. It's a very curious thing. I mean, my whole life and the life of my brother have been shadowed by these revelatory events that we didn't really, well, I guess that's a bit overstated. We asked for it, but we never knew we would get it in such spades. Last week was the 25th anniversary of the experiment at La Chorrera.